When Donald Trump took office in 2017, few predicted that one of the most enduring legacies of his presidency would be a dramatic restructuring of the global trade system. With a single word, tariffs, Trump launched an aggressive, controversial, and world-altering campaign to protect American industries. But these policies didn't just hit China. They sent shockwaves through nearly every corner of the global economy, forcing companies to rewrite strategies, rethink alliances, and reimagine how and where they do business. What began as a nationalist economic play turned into a defining moment in international commerce. Whether you love or hate Trump, one thing is clear. The world of business was never the same again. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on billions of dollars worth of imports. These included a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, targeting countries around the world, including key allies like Canada and the EU. But the biggest fireworks came with the trade war against China. Over $250 billion in Chinese imports were hit, including everything from electronics and machinery to household goods. In retaliation, China struck back, hard targeting American agriculture and manufacturing. For the average consumer, it meant higher prices. For corporations, it was a strategic earthquake. American farmers were some of the first casualties. China, once one of the largest importers of U.S. soybeans, pivoted elsewhere, dealing a massive blow to American agriculture. Many farms closed or operated at a loss, forcing the federal government to deploy billions in bailout funds just to keep rural communities afloat. At the same time, manufacturing firms that had long relied on Chinese parts and labor had to either absorb the costs or pass them on to customers. Companies like Apple began shifting manufacturing out of China into Southeast Asia and India, catalyzing a global reshuffling of supply chains that continues today. The steel and aluminum tariffs, meanwhile, had mixed outcomes. On one hand, U.S. steel companies like Nucor and U.S. Steel saw short-term gains, increased investment, and expanded operations. On the other, downstream industries, automakers, construction companies, and equipment manufacturers saw costs rise. Ford estimated losses exceeding $1 billion due to the tariffs, and General Motors issued warnings about shrinking margins. Even Harley-Davidson announced it would move some of its production overseas to avoid retaliatory tariffs imposed by the European Union. In an ironic twist, a policy meant to protect American manufacturing was, in some cases, pushing it further offshore. Small and mid-sized businesses, the backbone of the U.S. economy, were particularly vulnerable. These firms often lacked the leverage to negotiate better deals or restructure supply chains quickly. Many relied on specific parts or materials that suddenly became prohibitively expensive. Some businesses folded, while others made hard pivots, either by raising prices, reducing staff, or moving production closer to home. For those that adapted, the tariffs acted as a painful wake-up call, prompting innovations in logistics, automation, and domestic sourcing. Globally, countries affected by U.S. tariffs took the opportunity to forge new partnerships. The European Union, Canada, Japan, and other economies began pushing for trade agreements that excluded the U.S., effectively isolating it from the global trade consensus it once led. China, undeterred, doubled down on its Belt and Road Initiative, deepening economic ties across Asia, Africa, and Europe to offset losses in the American market. The result was a geopolitical and economic realignment, one that reduced the world's dependence on U.S. trade and raised the stakes for American exporters. And yet, perhaps the most profound impact of Trump's tariffs wasn't an economic hit, was psychological. For decades, businesses had grown accustomed to a global economy characterized by relative stability and predictability. Trade policy followed a set of norms. Tariffs were rare and usually part of slow-moving disputes. Trump shattered that illusion. Suddenly, policy could change overnight via tweet, press conference, or executive order. Uncertainty became the norm, and with it, the need for agility. This forced companies to develop a new kind of resilience. Risk management became a core strategic function. Firms had to be ready to shift sourcing, relocate facilities, or adapt pricing at a moment's notice. Agility replaced scale as the defining advantage in global commerce. For the firms that could move fast, Tesla, for example, which adjusted its global production footprint and deepened ties with local governments, opportunity followed. For slower players, it meant playing catch-up in an increasingly fragmented world. Ironically, many of the tariffs Trump imposed remain in place today. The Biden administration, while adopting a less confrontational tone, has largely maintained the new trade boundaries. This continuity signals a broader shift, that America's trade policy, once bipartisan and cooperative, is now more combative and protectionist. It also suggests that tariffs, once seen as a relic of pre-globalization economics, are now a permanent fixture in the modern business landscape. In this new world, countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and India have emerged as big winners. As firms look to diversify beyond China, these nations have seen surges in foreign investment and industrial expansion. Mexico, in particular, has benefited from nearshoring, the trend of relocating production closer to the U.S. to reduce geopolitical risk. Southeast Asia has also boomed, becoming a key node in the new global supply web. Meanwhile, American consumers have felt the effects in subtle but significant ways. Prices for appliances, electronics, and vehicles edged higher. Supply chain snarls became more common. Even the inflation spikes seen post-pandemic were partly driven by the structural changes in trade initiated by the tariff era. These weren't just isolated events, they were symptoms of a deeper transformation playing out beneath the surface. Notably, the tariff wars also revealed just how interdependent the global economy had become. Disruptions in one region quickly rippled across continents. A tariff on Chinese semiconductors could delay the launch of a smartphone in California, which in turn might affect an advertising campaign in London. The invisible threads that connect economies became starkly visible and fragile. For some, this led to calls for greater self-reliance. For others, it reinforced the need for stronger international cooperation. Even now in 2025, executives across the world are still recalibrating their global strategies. The question is no longer, how can we globalize? But rather, how can we globalize smarter? Companies are investing more in data-driven forecasting, geopolitical analysis, and multi-continent manufacturing networks. The days of placing all bets on one country or one system are over. So what can we learn from this? Whether you view Trump's tariffs as a strategic masterstroke or an economic blunder, they undeniably forced a reckoning. They exposed vulnerabilities, prompted adaptations, and redefined the rules of the game. The businesses that thrived weren't necessarily the biggest or richest, they were the ones willing to evolve. And here's the twist. The world may be headed toward even more economic fragmentation. With rising nationalism, AI-driven automation, and renewed focus on domestic manufacturing, the blueprint for global business is shifting again. But this time, companies know what's at stake. They've seen what happens when policy becomes unpredictable, and they've built the muscle memory to survive. So the next time you hear tariff, don't just think about taxes on goods. Think about the ripple effects, the lost contracts, the restructured supply chains, the new alliances. Because in today's economy, one policy shift can flip the entire board. If you're serious about understanding the forces shaping global business, don't just scroll subscribe. We decode the trends that drive markets, uncover the moves behind corporate strategy, and tell the real stories behind the headlines.